I'd like to thank you all for coming to this Conversations with Writers event from the Off the Page reading series. We are delighted and proud today to present a reading from QC alumna Ava Chin, and then afterwards she will be in conversation with QC President Frank H. Wu. We are very, very honored to have them both here. Ava Chin is the author of the award-winning Eating Wildly and MOTT STREET, which was named a Best Book of 2023 by Time, the San Francisco Chronicle, Kirkus Reviews, and Elle, and appeared in the 2024 American Library Association's Notable Books list. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Village Voice, Spin, and Vibe. She is the recipient of fellowships from the New York Public Library's Cullman Center, the Fulbright Program, the New York Foundation for the Arts, the New York Institute for the Humanities, and the Asian American Writers Workshop. She received a PhD from the University of Southern California, an MA from Johns Hopkins, and a BA from right here in the English department at Queens College. She's a professor of creative nonfiction at the College of Staten Island and the CUNY Graduate Center, where she is the head of the American Studies Certificate Program. Frank H. Wu serves as the 11th president of Queens College. He was a member of the faculty at Howard University, the nation's leading historically Black college university, for a decade. Frank is the author of Yellow, Race in America Beyond Black and White. Prior to his academic career, he held a clerkship with the late U.S. District Judge Frank J. Battisti in Cleveland and practiced law with the firm of Morrison and Forster in San Francisco. He received a BA from the Johns Hopkins University and a JD with honors from the University of Michigan. Thank you so much for joining us for this fascinating event. And please welcome QC alumna Ava Chin and QC President Frank H. Wu.
All right, so who says you can't ever come back home again, right? It is such a pleasure to be here. I spent so many years in the English department at QC. In fact, I remember when Clapper was a brand new building. So that says something. We will be talking a bit about how I started to write this book, the impetus for it. But I'm going to presume that folks haven't had a chance to read it yet, although I know that there are some people in the audience who have. But I really want to just emphasize how thrilled I am to be here with you, to be standing here in my middle age, kind of looking back at versions of myself, my much younger self. So it's really thrilling that there are undergrads here at QC. How many of you are undergrads here? Okay, and how many of you are graduate students, out of curiosity? Okay, mostly, yes. We're all grad students at heart, former grad students at heart, right, John? So this is a book that really did get its genesis from the classes that I took here at Queens College. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but I first want to tell you a little bit about myself. And I'm a fifth generation Chinese American New Yorker. I'm descendant from a Chinese railroad worker, so big ups to him for that work that he did in the late 19th century and the 1860s. And I discovered that, these stories when I was growing up really captured my imagination. What I noticed is that a lot of these stories weren't reflected back to me in the literature that I was reading when I was growing up. At the same token, I'm also raised by a single mother. And I did not know my father when I was growing up, including when I was an undergraduate here. And when I was an undergrad in the English department where I was studying creative writing, one of my fiction writers, when he learned that I grew up not knowing my dad, and I didn't know him, indeed I hadn't met him at that time, said to me, Ava, that is the wound that made you a writer. And this was the kind of thing that I thought about for many, many years, and it's stuck with me, right? And writers often think, well, what happened in your life that made you a writer, right? So for many years, because my professor had said this, and I love this professor, by the way. Yeah, I was his research assistant when I was in undergrad. He's no longer here. He's long retired. But for the longest time, I thought that was the reason that made me a writer. It was only after writing this book and doing decades of research that I realized actually the wound of my father walking out was not the only thing that made me a writer, right? And I'm gonna go back to this by the end of our conversation. Okay, so I wanna just read you, tell you sort of the story. I started collecting a lot of these stories while I was an undergraduate here, collecting stories from my family members because of those two things. Number one, not seeing the stories that I thought needed to be told, that were told in my family, but I didn't see it reflected in our literature. I knew that was one impetus for being a writer, right? The other was, who was this family that I was estranged from? All I knew was that my dad and his family were bigwigs in Chinatown. But what did that even mean, right? And the family that I knew, by the time I was born, hated my father. And it turned out my parents actually never talked to each other after my dad split. They only spoke to each other through each other's lawyers. So for many years as a kid, I grew up wanting to understand who I was in relation to this family and who they were in relation to each other. And I think as a nonfiction writer, I was continuously thinking, well, what is the larger story at work? And I'm going to just sort of describe to you on the first day that I met my father. I first saw my father as a pair of feet in Italian leather shoes, bounding down the carpeted staircase of his office building on one of the oldest streets in Chinatown. It was a cold, rainy, late afternoon in mid-February. This is 27 years ago. When I arrived only 10 minutes before, I stood at the threshold hesitating. On the door, on the side, was a buzzer with my father's name on it. This building was a building in Chinatown that I had passed numerous times before. And I was trying to stay calm and take deep, even breaths. I had never hidden anything this big from the family who raised me, but I had been waiting my entire life for this moment. And finally, I pushed the buzzer. Now, this building that I was standing in front of was actually the oldest row house in all of Manhattan. And it was certainly the oldest building in Chinatown. It's really right on the edge of Chinatown. And again, I had passed by this building numerous times before and never realized that my father had an office there, right? Suddenly, when the doors were flung open, I saw this small face with a thin, protective smile carefully peering down at me. I had the sensation that I was meeting someone very familiar, yet very odd. It was rather like being studied from across time and down the long end of an old unfolding telescope. This was my father. And in that moment, as he stared at me, I knew that I needed to be perfect, even if it meant that I had to contort myself into someone completely unrecognizable, someone who spoke softly and reasonably, who wasn't loud and impossible, an A-plus Asian daughter with perfect emotional pitch who wouldn't scare him away with her anger or give him cause to push her away. The thought of my father rejecting me all over again made the surface of my skin buzz like glass just before the cracks appear. So we went upstairs to his office and we talked for a while, and we talked for so long about what he had done, the person that he was. My dad was one of Chinatown's first lawyers. He became one of the first wannabe politicians who wanted to represent the neighborhood and the entire Lower East Side and in the state assembly, right? So these were things that he was searching for, and I was asking him lots and lots of questions because I was really trying to understand this person that I'd always wanted to know. And later, we were talking for so long that he was decided, like, let's go have dinner, right? And so we walked out on the streets of Chinatown, and he said to me, "You see that store over there? That's where we had Chinatown's first coffee shop. That's what we ran. You see that store over there, that basement over there? That's, when I was a kid, that was an opium den." And then he pointed straight up the block towards a red brick, 6-story apartment building that seemed to flank the entire neighborhood. And he said, "Do you see that window over there? That's where your gongong and pawpaw, that's where they used to live, right? And you see that building over there, that window over there, that's where your great-grandparents used to live." So all of a sudden, I learned, just in that moment, that this building that I had passed by numerous times before actually housed generations of the side of my family that I had most wanted to connect with. As I stood there, I realized that this building held the key to something just much more than just our family. I discovered that the other side of my family also lived in that building. And that, in fact, my mother's side of the family was upstairs neighbors from my father's downstairs family, right? This family, again, that I'd only ever heard, I've never seen in the same room together. And by the time I was born, they'd only ever spoken to each other through each other's lawyers, had in fact gone to the same churches, attended the same schools, summered together out on the Jersey Shore, right? Belonged to the same Boy Scout troops, right? And had actually eaten dinner at each other's homes and apartments long before I was born. Then I discovered, as I was doing the research, and again, this is only a couple of years after I graduated from Queens College, what I discovered is that there was this overarching apparatus that existed called the Chinese Exclusion Act laws. This was our country's first immigration restrictions, right? The first ever immigration restrictions that we had. Prior to that, our borders were entirely open, right? And so when this legislation was passed in the 19th century, and it lasted for over 60 years, both sides of my family were subject to these immigration restrictions and had to learn how to navigate them. And so that's when I realized that, in fact, this book was not just about my family. It was about something much larger that impacted both the Chinese American diaspora in this country, as well as touched upon American history today.